Okay, three, two, one, and we're live. Hey everyone, welcome back to Studies in Counseling. I'm here today with new friend of the show, Jameson Webster. How are you today, Jameson?
Good. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, we're really grateful to be able to connect with you on the show. And we like to ask this question right at the beginning about absorption or like being fascinated. So I'm curious, what has been absorbing you recently in your life?
Well, my almost 3-year-old is has I'm absorbed in her, as one is in young children. Um, and the navigating of language and the navigating of threes, I think, at this point. I mean, not just because she's turning 3, that sounds slightly psychotic, but she's trying to figure out two conflicting objects in relationship to herself, which is interesting to have watched that emerge on the field. Um, and then I've been working on a book on breathing, so I've been thinking a lot about that.
Ooh. Yeah, I'm like wanting to connect these two things, like the development of speech and breathing. Like, how has it been like mothering at this developmental stage while working on a text about breathing?
It's been great. I mean, she's all over the book, and it's sort of framed by her, and it's framed by the closeness to the bodily dimensions of learning to speak and making noises and communicating, and how close that is to breath. And also how a lot of breath practices, which I'm not against or anything like that, but how they often neglect the speech dimension of it, as if you could go back to some, I don't know, like pure breath. And I think that, like, for children very early, it's already connected with sound making. So
And do you think communication too?
yeah,
Like,
absolutely.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, it's interesting to think about. I have to do some breath meditations and like, what is that trying to communicate? Like there is like a communication there. Like you're saying, it's like a fantasy of returning to some kind of, I don't know, like Zen primordial state, maybe.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I mean, I like the kind of psychoanalysis and Eastern practices coming at something from different angles, I guess. But I also think that they're diametrically opposed, and that should be recognized.
Hmm.
Even if they approach the same thing from different angles, that also means that they're opposite, they're really from different places and speaking to different things. So
Yeah. Oh, and yeah, so your text is kind of like the psychoanalytic account of breath because yeah, like mindfulness, meditation, etc. They very much so. That seems to be a similarity in a lot of these traditions, is that breath becomes like really fundamental. Cool.
yeah, it's like the psychoanalytic response to the question of breathing, and trying to bring back language, trying to bring back sexuality, trying to bring back um, you know, climate change, like the idea of free breathing in a world where we might not, like, air is going to become a privilege and a scarce resource. It seems
Mm.
kind of funny to want to put, I don't know, breathing back in place where breathing's collapsing. So
Yeah. Oh, it is interesting. Yeah, the air. I'm wondering. I'm kind of intrigued by this idea that psychoanalysis and like some Eastern spiritualities are approaching something from different angles. Like, what are you approaching? Do you think?
well, from when you think about it from the Freudian perspective and you look at the analysts who got interested in breath, it seems to kind of target the question of repression.
Mm.
And Freud upheld the idea that there would always be repression, and repression isn't something to undo. Repression saves you to a certain extent. And a lot of the Eastern breath practices and the ways in which psychoanalysts have got involved with the Eastern questions is they want to undo repression. I think that the Eastern breath practices go from the body towards the navel of the unconscious. And I think that the psychoanalysts start from consciousness and go towards the navel. So, they're going
Ooh.
towards the same place, but I don't advocate, like, a kind of Reichian somatic undoing of all repressions to, save the world and have better sex. Like, this is where I like draw the line. And I'm not a Jungian by any stretch of the imagination. I don't have a problem with Jung, but I don't want to like reach towards the sacred and pretend that that's a place that's narrativized. If there's a collective unconscious, which I'm interested in terms of phylogenetic inheritance, for me, it's not that, it's the specificities of how our traumas tap into generations of trauma. And you can only work, in my perspective, with that through representations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah, super interesting. Like I think that this is something I've been thinking about because you're like intervening, of course, like clinically with clients, and you do like education, and you do talking about current events and like cultural work. And so I've been thinking a lot about like this idea in psychoanalysis of the cure,
Mm-hmm.
and how that compares to like political projects, or
Mm-hmm.
to like trying to compare like cure and utopia, for example.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know, can you like associate to that or riff on that a little bit? Like how do you think about cure, utopia, the intersections between like political projects and
Yeah, I think I would be really careful. I mean, I think that the Reichian utopian project, or maybe even the Jungian utopia project, I think that they were disastrous, to be honest. I mean, Reich is more obvious in a way. And I'm not saying that Jungian work is disastrous, but I somehow think the project that he underwent and like the psychosis inducing kind of 60s vibe can be really problematic. And if you stick with the cure as each person's cure, you can't generalize it. You can't even generalize the idea that your outcome is good. I mean, I kind of worry these days about where psychoanalysis becomes synonymous with some, like anti-fascist
hmm,
project. And I'm not, it's not like I want to say like, you're potentially making fascist or something. I wouldn't do that, but I just think you have to be careful to say something like that.
hmm,
Um, you know, uh, and I don't think that you have the privilege of actually knowing what your patients will do, can do, would do with the work that you do with them. I mean, they leave and they live their life. So I think there's something presumptuous about a lot of stated, generalized, universalized outcomes.
hmm. Yeah, there's something like you're not wanting to kind of bring in some kind of political project into your clinical work.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah,
both
except for wait, there's a place for politics. Hold on, my door just like creaked open and the noises from the house will.
That's great. Go for it.
I'm actually working on a project, or I like TBD will be working on a project with Patricia Garavici on the place of the political in various cures, looking at it case by case, to show how there's something very different about the place that politics emerges or the place where you encounter it, or what's surprising about the political that can emerge from various like examples. So I mean, we'll do Freudian ones. I worked on Woodrow Wilson. I want to talk about that, and we'll look at Little Hans and the female homosexual, and then we're also going to look at other cases. I think Francoise Dolto's Dominique, one of the first trans patients that Patricia knows a lot about, and then Devereaux, who did the indigenous Indian. It's like a famous study of a psychoanalyst in the, I think, 30s or 40s, working with someone from the indigenous population. So, like I think the conclusions are surprising, that they go against a lot of the political generalizations. And nevertheless, there is a politics that emerges, but it almost emerges despite the patient, despite the analyst, that's very singular and against the grain. Like in Dolto's case, Dominique, I mean, this is actually what got me interested in the project. For a long time, she has a kind of mother blamey stance with Dominique, who's like a kind of psychoticized child.
Hmm.
And she's like, got to get this kid away from the mother, got to get this kid away from the mother. They need to separate. Like, it's completely incestuous. Like, this mother, keeps this child in her bed, keeps this child like an appendage to herself. And you can get very uncomfortable with the way that she talks about it. And it's very dyadic and there's no world. But she does this incredible work to separate them. And once they accept it, there's the possibility of a world. And once there's that possibility of the world, you realize that the mother and child were being kept in a very infantile situation by the father.
Mm.
The whole relationship between her and her son caught in this thing. The father is refusing either of them to have an independent life. And their histories have to do with colonialism and World War II. That there's like long histories of racism and colonialism and the contradictions of this family and emerging from that trauma that are part of the, for lack of a better word, fucked upness of the situation. And you can't blame the mother. You almost, in a way, you can't blame the father, although he comes out at a certain point as someone who's really refusing for them to have a life. And the boy who was previously psychotic is very suddenly like shows how aware he is of all of this generational drama. I mean, in the most beautiful fashion. And so this is very different from coming in and saying like, look at these, we have to decolonize this
Yeah.
family. I mean, there's something like you have to work psychoanalytically and then the world will be there. The
This,
world will emerge in all of its specificity.
yeah, this is an interesting point. Okay, so speaking of absorption, one thing I noticed from looking through your works is you like philosophy, right? Like there's a philosophy is like a thing you're interested in. And I'm thinking about like a debate in philosophy, like a historical debate about like materialism and idealism. And
Yeah.
so I don't know a lot about that, but I'm thinking about these like ID words, like words that start with ID. And it's like ideology, idealism, ideas.
Mhm.
It's like there's somewhat of a danger, maybe, or maybe there's something about psychoanalysis just wants to reveal what's happening,
Mhm.
like what's actually there. And there's like whether you're being like overly psychoanalytic and saying this is definitely an Oedipus complex before doing the analysis, or oh, this is definitely patriarchy colonialism, that could like obscure what's actually happening. And there's an idea that maybe there's like that humility or something if you
Mhm.
actually go through the process, like the symptom in its specificity will emerge. Would you agree with that reflection?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm definitely a materialist.
Yeah.
I
What, what it,
think I was previously an idealist. I think my own analysis had to cure me of this.
yeah. And
Yeah.
I do you think that's at the root of kind of what you're saying a little bit about the Jung and Reich stuff, is they're coming in with like really strong ideas and that could maybe obscure what's actually happening in there,
I
or
think,
how their
yeah,
interpretations. Yeah.
yeah. I think Freud thought so also. Not, not to like just Freud is right situation, but I think that that's what he was getting fussy about. Um, and there's a really important place in the history of psychoanalytic politics for like ideology critique, Slavoj Žižek style. But I also think that we've reached the limits of that.
Would it, can you tell me what that means? The ideology critique. Sorry, like what does that look like for you?
Like Zizek's first books, The Sublime Object of Ideology, and the ways in which he used psychoanalysis to kind of show how it interrogates the ideologies at work. And, he's excellent, Zizek, and incredibly important. At the same time, I think it reached its limit. I think people are a little bit tired of paranoid critique, to be honest, and the knowingness of it, like what's
Mm.
ideological. I think the younger generations have taught me that they're pretty suspicious of this
Hmm.
at this point.
It's kind of a loop, isn't it? Like it's like, oh, who was it? I think it was some thinker, maybe William Blake or something. Like someone was critiquing like
Like
a
behind you.
yeah, exactly. William Blake is behind me. Uh, I think it's him. But someone in that era was like critiquing this suspicious guys, the masters of suspicion,
Yeah.
and saying that you're the thrust of it was like, how do you know this? Like, how are you able to heroically separate yourself from the systems you're talking about? And wouldn't it just be more rational to say that this is a function of the systems you're critiquing, which is kind of like recursive in what I'm saying? But I think that's kind of compelling, interesting idea. How would you escape something like that, though, like the loop?
I don't know. I'm very taken by Adam Phillips, who came to the New School this year, and he like made this real bid for pragmatism.
Hmm.
And I mean, I didn't go read the Pragmatists. He didn't inspire me that much. But I did read his last book and was interested in his thoughts about it. And I actually think that there's something in psychoanalysis, the traversal and the process is meant to help you be more pragmatic. It actually takes a lot of work to be pragmatic, and it's very difficult to be pragmatic. And I mean, the best analysts that I've loved over the course of my life, especially ones who work in inpatient hospitals, show you what it takes to be pragmatic in a completely chaotic, mad situation. And that's for me the best of what a psychoanalyst can do, is kind of cut through all of it, all the bullshit, all the anxiety, all of the whatever difficulties that we get ourselves into in terms of being able to make a decision. I mean, you could take a philosophical stance and say that it's like, from an experience of the impossible, you understand better what's possible. You would say something like this.
Mm, yeah, yeah. Because I was thinking about with this pragmatism point that Adam Phillips was talking about. It's kind of hard because, right, like with like human beings and motivation, like ideals and mythology feels very motivating to me. Like I get very motivated by stories and narratives, and they can really hook me. And yeah, it's not that compelling to be like, you'll get a little less. How does Freud say it? It's like you'll be a little more sad, but smarter. It's like,
Ordinary unhappiness.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's not the most compelling vision.
No, but I mean, it's very difficult because I think, um, I don't know, until you've been knocked down the way analysis knocks you down a couple notches, you can't convince people that ordinary unhappiness will be better than their extraordinary unhappiness. So it's an image
Mm.
for the converted, and so it's a real problem. We have a proselytizing problem on our hands. We can't proselytize with this, but I mean, there's something so right to me about this with Freud and different experiences with patients ending their analysis. Like it's a real acceptance of limitation.
What do you think, Jameson, about with this? Okay, with this proselytizing problem, like, what do you think? Because the political examples, the ones you liked of psychoanalysis, which I'll have to study more, but they seem to me to, and even how I've heard you talk about Freud before too. Like Freud's one of his innovations is like listening to women, like taking what they're saying very seriously. And then the examples you're talking about were like people who it was almost like an access, like opening the doors, giving like to a transgender individual and like listening to them. Uh, like, do you think like something like a street clinic or like more like intervening on the levels of access
Hmm.
is more appropriate for like, and that's not so not putting the ideology or the practices of like social justice or something necessarily in the method of psychoanalysis, but more so
Oh yeah, in
structurally.
actions that we take in the world rather than, proliferating theories for and against one another. It'd be much better if people were trying to spend their time figuring out what to do. Because I mean, there's just a huge black hole mental health in this country. It's a disaster. I mean, and everyone knows that.
Yeah.
So, what are we going to do about it? And there's probably many, many levels at which this has to be taken up, on state levels, on local levels, on national levels, on national organizations like the American Psychological or the, national social work. I mean, I don't know. There's a million different things that one can do, like on the political end. And then if you just give up on that, which I don't blame anyone for doing, then there's things that you have to do much more locally, like mutual aid style, or just the fact that like all of us pro bono, a lot of hours and a lot of hours for trying to train different kinds of clinicians and clinicians with different ethnicities so that we have more diversity in the field. I mean, there's just like the list of things to do is unending, and I'm surprised how hard it is. I mean, I'm not
Mm.
surprised how hard it is. I mean, that's sort of what you face in psychoanalysis is how difficult it is for human beings to take action and work with one another. It doesn't go very well.
Yeah. I
I mean,
wonder if,
all the idealism in the world, you know, watch what happens when you put 10 people in a room and tell them to figure out what to do together.
yeah, exactly. Okay. So this is kind of a sideways association and it's a bit into self-disclosure, but about like like obstacles. Um, obstacles are very attractive, like I'm very attracted to people who are unavailable. And somebody was saying that like the loss of the chaperone is like one of the reasons that people are more impotent now. That might be a bit reductive, but that was like a very evocative idea for me. Like having a chaperone that you could sneak away from is kind of like hot. Um, but obstacles, like
This is a very obsessional problem. I don't think I have this problem.
yeah, um, uh, yeah, definitely have like an obsession, but like obstacles and desire, I guess. Like a world without obstacles, is that like a utopia? I guess is the question I'm asking. And then how to work with that more like politically, I guess is kind of what I'm thrusting towards.
I don't know. I mean, the obstacle is a particularly obsessional problem because they like it's the desire for an impossible desire. So the obstacle is there to elevate the impossibility and the inaccessibility of the object. And I mean, personally, I think that that's hellish because you're constantly trying to put obstacles there. And I'm exhausted of obstacles. I mean,
Mm,
not professionally because that's, we're constantly dealing with obstacles to pushing further in a treatment and obstacles that one creates in their own life. I don't think more obstacles is the solution. The solution is kind of deconstructing these phantasms that are in the way of actually being able to support your own desire.
mm,
Because the obstacle is a crutch, right? I mean, you desire, and what you desire, the object of your desire has nothing to do with desire because the object is phantasmatic. The object is already gone, as it were. So I
mm,
mean, the whole point of analysis to an extent is despite the limitations of the world, despite what's disappointing to us, despite our fear of our own desire, you're able to support your desire. You're able to do something. And it would behoove everybody to um find this possibility. And that's, I mean, that's as close as I get to psychoanalytic utopianism, except for the fact that not everybody's up for this. And it's also in order to get to this place, it takes so long and it takes so much attention, both by the analysand and the analyst. How can we imagine this for 9 billion people? I mean,
mm.
so then what? This is now unimaginable. I've just put before you a utopian project, but it's
Thank
also
you.
unimaginable. So then what?
Okay. Before I might have an answer to it, but
Okay.
then what? But I want to first make sure I understand. So the psychoanalytic utopianism, can we sketch that out a little bit? So it would be a world where we don't feel like we need to have an obstacle to desire. Is that it?
Sure. Yeah, you don't either have to sustain your misery in order because you're afraid of satisfaction, or you don't have to have an
Mm,
obstacle in the way so that you don't actually achieve satisfaction.
yeah. I
So
think,
the idea is more possibilities of real satisfaction, but not in the Reichian sense of like complete, absolute, like individual, liberatory, orgasmic, whatever. Or Jungian sacred rating the lockbox, but your
mm,
individual possibilities for achieving satisfaction in your life, given the constraints of the world and your history.
yeah, like my current mission statement is to, I wonder how this maps on to the utopianism. It's like I'm trying to suffer in new ways,
Mhm.
um, instead of suffering in the same old way again and again, like explore new forms of suffering. Um, and which again isn't like the most compelling vision statement, but I think that's like what communism or something would be too. Like, if you were able to abolish the unfreedom in capitalism, it's not like there would be utopia. I mean, it would still have the same suffering, similar forms of existential human suffering. Um, but I think like one thing I learned in my analysis was like I'm fascinated by. I think this is what the obsession probably protects from,
Mhm.
and it might be individual, but I'm talking about it because hopefully it'll generalize more. Um, is my favorite writers have all like killed themselves. Virginia Woolf, John Berryman, um, David Foster Wallace. These people like killed themselves, and one thing they all reading their work, I noticed that it was soon after success, actually. And so I feel like they had this. This is kind of my own gloss on it. Like they had this mountain, successful artist, successful writer, great writer, and they like achieved it, and there was still depression. And then it's like there's literally like nowhere to go after that. Once there's like an obsession like that, or they felt in their psyches like there's nowhere to go. I think that's scary. Like, so I think empathetically, I understand why people don't want to reach their goals because it's like you can motivate yourself to fight something.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, the problem with success isn't, I mean, a lot of writers that commit suicide often commit suicide because they can't write, that they were writing to survive. And being successful, I don't know if it's the success or the fact that being successful makes writing harder because I don't know, there's a lot more pressure and there's a lot more attention. I mean, there's something
Mm,
great about writing in a vacuum. So I don't know if it's success itself or the problem at least. Um, because if they, I mean, there's a certain problem amongst severe melancholics in that regard. Like if they don't write, they will kill themselves. So most of them kill themselves when they stop being able to write, when they're in a certain period of not having that whatever outlet, if you want to put it that way.
mm,
Um, I mean, people who are more neurotically inclined, I think, will do something less less destructive to their being, but something destructive to their career, or go on a bender or humiliate themselves in public, or like ruin it for themselves to maybe get back into the position to have to make it all better again. To be in the same kind of suffering state.
mm. Just quick aside, real quick. This is fascinating, but personality. So you're talking about personality. So for people, um, psychoanalytic ideas around personality, like how would you gloss that? Like you're talking about. So for people who are maybe working more from DSM, more
Oh,
descriptive behavioral things, like how would you gloss like what you're talking about?
um, it's a good question. I mean, the psychoanalysis has a different diagnostic system because it's thought of as structured. So, if there was depression in the context of a melancholic personality, or depression in the context of a manic personality, or depression in the context of a obsessive or a phobic or hysteric, we don't have that many categories. We have 7. Hysteric, obsessive, phobic, melancholic, manic. I sort of take Darian Leader's point that we shouldn't combine the melancholic manic person, that they're two different people. Schizophrenic and paranoid.
Mm.
So that's it. That's all we got. And
Yeah.
it's not to say like that you like say someone's that, but that we have to use it to think. I think it's really important. Like the DSM says, like you have this problem, it's probably biological in some way, shape, or form.
Mhm.
Or, so ingrained that it's now a disorder. And I think that these are structures. Everyone participates in all the structures. We use the structures to think. We think about what predominates in another moment. We might be wrong. We have to revise it. We have to see what happens. It's always like a thesis that allows the analyst to think and direct the treatment, not something that we ascribe to someone's being.
Mhm.
Yeah.
It's not like a latent disease. Yeah. Yeah, yeah. It's so interesting. And the point I like to say, I specialize, I love working with addiction. Not I love, I find it meaningful to work with addiction. And I think this way of thinking, it's what got me into psychoanalysis, is so helpful because it's just so fundamentally different. Like someone at a casino partying and binge drinking, and a person in their room at night, no one knows, and they're drinking 3 bottles of wine, and no one knows until everything comes crashing down. This is a fundamental different structure, but they will get the same DSM diagnosis, and it's just not, that doesn't help us think,
Yeah.
and it can actually be
Even
disastrous.
someone addicted to crystal meth versus someone addicted to weed.
Yeah,
They're very different problems.
yeah, yeah, and depending on the structure, like you're saying, it can fundamentally, you can do a great harm, or do nothing, probably more often, or do less than it's possible.
Let's do a great talk. God, I'm forgetting her name. I'm so embarrassed. But she gave a talk on, she's in the Lacanan addiction book,
Oh,
Rahel. Um, and she gave a talk on the fact that if the person is more on the psychotic spectrum, then they're using the alcohol to reduce jouissance. And that's a very different thing than a neurotic person who's trying to neurotically use a substance and potentially bottom out. Because the psychotic person needs it, whereas the neurotic person is in a real self-destructive loop. It
mhm.
doesn't mean that the psychotic person, you don't have to deal with it somehow, but it's very, very different. And when she made this point, it completely made sense to me, and I thought it was so right.
Yeah, yeah, and then it also really helps with this thing.
If
Like
you're going
it's,
through a phase of hearing voices, you might need to drink.
yeah, and it might not be a bad idea. Like yeah, I think speaking of ideology critique, one area of life that I think it's still very helpful is like with the temperance movement, and just this assumption that drugs are a priori, drugs and alcohol are just a priori demonic.
Mhm.
Like actually, I like to think of like the people think they like possess people and like make them do shitty things.
Horrible.
Yeah. Okay, so thank you for that, into going into personality a little bit. But I think this point about the writers was interesting because I've been noticing you've been engaged a lot in art recently. Like
Mhm.
I read a very interesting thing about some I'm forgetting the names, but a sculptor. It was
Mhm.
very, very interesting. So yeah, art. Like, what has that been like to follow, be exploring art, and how does that relate to your work?
Well, I do a lot of catalog essays for money. It's
What
actually how I
what
ended up in the art world.
what kind of essays?
Catalog essays.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Yeah. I mean, I make a joke because it's everyone's like, "Oh, you're so interested in art," and I'm like, "Am I?" Like,
Interested in
it was
money.
like kind of a practical decision. It was kind of like a practical thing. No, I mean, it's not that I'm not interested in artists and that I don't enjoy it, but I actually started doing it because of practical reasons. It's one of the few places that one can get paid to write. Um, and it was nice because it was like I like homework assignments, and I have to go learn about them and do my homework and figure out what to do. And there's a lot of freedom in it as well, which is also very nice. But I think there's something unique about once one is in a category of someone who has the capacity to sublimate. I mean, it's a word that's not understood or well defined and so on and so forth. But nevertheless, if you have someone who writes or someone who paints or someone who's developed that capacity, which doesn't mean that they're famous, but it means that they can sit down and do it every day and they have a project that drives them. They're in a very special category. I don't even think that you can like neurosis, psychosis, psychoanalyze them. There's someone who have been able to do something with their body, with their life, with their existence. So I love to look at the specific examples of that, but I also, it's very important as a message to psychoanalysts to like back off, actually, because you don't psychoanalyze this person. You get interested in what they tell you about psychoanalysis, in fact.
That is really interesting. Yeah. Okay. So you admire artists a lot.
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
And what you
absolutely.
and can you say more about the okay, one of our keywords, I like to have like an associative semi-structured style, but I have this keyword of process.
Hmm.
And is that related to the what you admire, like a process, like a creative process?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's that they have gotten themselves to a place where they've developed a process that they are invested in. The artists that I've worked with, I don't think it's because of their fame, and obviously not everyone becomes famous, but that they have developed a relentlessness. They've developed a process that's uniquely theirs. And to go back to the materialism, it's absolutely material. It's not even ideas that drive them. It's always something about the paint, something about the process, something about, I mean, for writers, they have certain ways that they get into writing, certain rituals that they do. And this is very hard. It's very hard to get to that place where one can do this and sustain it. And so for those who are able to, for me, it's incredible.
Such a good point about the sensuality,
Hmm.
especially painters. I've dated a lot of painters. And I think that's what I admire about them is like for me, what dominates in my head is this image of a painter,
Hmm.
which is pretty stupid. It's not realistic, but they love these people, these individual artists who are just so gifted. They just liked the feeling of it. Like really, it was just very sensual and pleasurable. And yeah, so the material of like, do you enjoy writing? Because you seem to be pretty prolific. Do you find it pleasurable to write, or do you find what is the material aspect of writing? Because it's so linguistic and idea dominated.
I mean, honestly, I think of all of the sublimations, the writers are the unhappiest and angriest people,
Mm-hmm.
the loneliest and the most controlling. Um, so I think that being a writer is a curse. So I wouldn't say that I love writing, and I also don't write like the way that writers write. Like they write all the time, and I don't
I see.
write in like bursts because it's so lonely and unpleasant.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know. I don't know. I know everyone talks about my prolificness. I'm not entirely sure. It's like a bursty kind of a thing.
Gotcha. Well, you don't have the neurosis of not being able to finish. Like you can finish things. Like you like finishing your homework.
I like finishing my homework. I like getting rid of it. I don't want to see it ever again. I don't want to think about it ever again. I don't care how many mistakes there are. It's someone else's job to fix it. I have like a ugh, which
Yeah, it's just like
is
take this away
good.
from.
Which is good. Yeah, I'm not gonna sit. I don't like, I mean, all that like keeping it in your head is horrible. Ugh. Like people who write like giant books and novels, I mean, power to them, but like that's never gonna be me.
Oh yeah, what was her
That's
name?
like
I
sitting in your shit.
Yeah, yeah. There was this. She's on my reading list. I'm blanking on her name, but her debut novel. She's a pretty famous American novelist, and she wrote this debut novel that was like very critically acclaimed, but it took like 7 years. She was friends with the guy who wrote American Psycho, but
Feel like I remember seeing someone's debut giant novel and I was like, wow.
yeah, it took like a really long time, and yeah, that is impressive. Like in its own way, like it's tolerating discomfort. Uh, um, okay, so you said something pretty
Yeah.
provocative. But
I would
was it?
be a I would be a dancer, a choreographer.
Oh, really? So you like dance?
Well, I think of myself as someone who would like dance had I taken that path, but I don't really know. Maybe I'd hate it. But
Yeah.
you're with other people, you move around, you don't like sit there on your computer for 7 years. I'd die. Yeah.
What do you think of
Collaborative.
what do you think of integration of like art therapy, uh, dance therapy? Like, what do you think of people who uh, fuse expressive arts?
I don't know. I mean, psychoanalysis, like real, dyed in the wool, Freudian style, at best 4 times a week. I guess in England they do it 5 times a week. I've never
Wow.
done it 5 times a week, but if you're doing that, you don't have room to do something else. And like the amount of concentration and the amount of time and the care around it and the frame of it. And I don't, I'm not someone who thinks of myself as rigid around this, but like if you actually do that, you don't have time integrating art therapy into your psychoanalytic practice. So I don't, like you have to, this has to be weighed, I think. And I think there's room to do all kinds of other things. I think there's all kinds of people. I think, everyone's got to figure out what they want, but psychoanalysis proper is tough. It's really its own thing. And it's a lot of work and it's very hard.
I really appreciate that point. I never thought of it with art. This is probably my own bias, but that's a critique I talk about, or something I share with like neuroscience, like when you're using a lot of neuroscience and like therapy, just basic counseling or any, it's a lot of things to digest. So if you're taking on another field, like it's just going to be like dilettantism, right? Like if you really want to like be a neuroscientist or be a therapist, it's probably not impossible, but it would just be an immense act. And maybe it's better to just own
Yeah. I mean, I think
everything.
read everything. I mean, like both Freud and Lacan wanted people to have incredibly diverse educations. It's not, I really don't think an analyst should around reading psychoanalysis. Like that's going to become demented. But just understand that doing psychoanalysis is a lot. And it takes, I mean, now having done it more lived more as an analyst than not. The place that you can get to after like 15 years of doing it is remarkable. And I think of how naive I was and how mistaken I was and how ideological or idealistic I was to
Mm-hmm.
begin with. And to get to a place where you have a kind of built-in know-how takes a long time. And if you're doing a million other things, you're not going to get there, which is the same thing for an artist. So, I mean, part of the reason that artists, I think, are a very good example for analysts is if you're a painter, you're going to have to mess around with paint for a decade before you're any good. You can do an MFA and that can be very helpful, but you have to know your materials. And to know materials takes all day long, every day, all day. I don't know. You could like Malcolm Gladwell this conversation, I guess, but
10,000 hours. Yeah. Deliberate practice. What about, what are the materials of an analyst? Like what's the, analog for you? Like what are your materials that you're working with?
I mean, the materials are the words of the patient. They're the holding of the frame, I think, of the session and how hard that is. I think there's the listening and listening with help, supervision, listening with colleagues, listening to your own bad listening and getting
Mm.
to know that. Understanding the place of your own life in the listening to patients and how it shouldn't have as much of a place as it often does.
Oh,
Uh, and then I think there's also something about having many patients every day, all day. And then you get a sense for the diversity. There's something really, it's very hard to move from like training to having a private practice because go from having like 4 or 5 patients to having 25 patients. And that's like a lot of people. That's a lot of people you're carrying around. And you have to learn to carry that much around.
yeah. Well, it was making me think, do you think, I really appreciate the materials you're talking about, like the listening, the supervision, the frame. What do you think of memory? Like, do you think like memory plays a role in that? Because I'm thinking of the physicality of memory.
Oh yeah, I think the physicality of memory is so important. My memory is so weird. My
Hmm.
memory with patients like astounds me. Um, like I saw someone I hadn't seen in, I don't know, like 6 years, and I sat in the session and like all the things were like bing bing, like things that I like didn't know that I knew. I mean, I knew them somewhere obviously because I was there at some point, but it's not like I can be like, if you had asked me about this person before they showed up in my room, I probably wouldn't have been able to say all that much. But presented with them, it was kind of amazing. And then the way you compartmentalize it. I mean, I know more about my patients than I do about my own family. I don't know
Right.
why. I mean, it's something about the practice and the physicality of the memory. I mean, I can remember amazing things about patients, a dream they had 10 years ago,
Yeah.
all of a sudden, and I can't remember, I don't know what my daughter's first word was. Terrible. I was like, what was it?
Well, yeah. I guess I'm like moved to like it kind of seems like magical or something or ritualistic, but I wonder if that it's connected to the frame idea. It's there's like something like that's like you're almost like in like it's a ritual, but the I think what rituals do materially is they like we like remember it's like when you smell something that reminds you of your grandmother. It's like that cliche. It's like memories come back. There's probably something with the senses, something
Yeah.
about them sitting like actually evokes that time for you.
And I think getting you really have to, Freud's whole idea that the analyst also practices this free floating attention in relation to the free association. I mean, you're trying to be in the least defensive places possible. I think like when you first have a patient, sometimes it's hard to remember a lot because you're scared, frankly, and you're a little defensive. And when you're really listening as an analyst, you're supposed to not be in a defensive posture. So there's a lot more capacity for absorption. In my life with my kids, it's like, like there's always, it's just, whatever, it's life. And so I'm not in that state where I'm like taking it all in. And that's rare and it's difficult to get to, and it takes time and it takes practice and it takes not being anxious as an analyst. And that takes a lot of time. And it also takes feeling like you know what you're doing, which hopefully you don't feel right away because that would be bullshit. So I don't know. I mean, that's the exciting part of it. And it's also very difficult because you can't tell someone, who hasn't experienced it. You have to tell them like you'll get there, but you need to put in the hours, as it were,
Yeah.
the effort and the discipline and rigor.
Yeah. The like when does one yeah reach this like I'm struck by this artist image. Well, I guess one thing I'm struck by, kind of our last keyword, which we'll get to
Mhm.
at the very end of our thing, is I like to think about development, like how things develop. And so, I mean, Freud sees himself as a scientist, right? And would you agree with that?
I don't know.
Maybe not. That could just be my bias or just what I've read secondhand.
I mean, it depends on the definition of science. So, like, I just read Heidegger's The World Image, and the picture that he paints of science is like monstrous. You don't want to be
Mm.
that science.
Yeah.
Constant activity, objectification of the world into a universal image that has nothing to do with life itself. I mean, I don't think that that's Freud's.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, because it might be kind of actually I'm kind of rethinking this question because like just historical context, like we're in such a different state. Like we've got like the randomized control trial. We've got this whole like thing that evokes science now, like the Boulder model and American psychology and stuff. I guess I'm just struck by you. What I'm really asking about is, and I think I've heard you say this, like analysis is art. Like it's kind of like an art, like how you see the process. And I'm just like curious about the link between art and science. I guess this kind of perennial question and how that affects you professionally.
I mean, science as um not in the institutional research positivistic sense. I think there's other sensibilities about it in terms of pushing a logic as far as it will go, different forms of observation, and trying to find how to structure or put a logic in relationship to observations about the world. I mean, what would have passed for scholastic research at an earlier point in time, like pre-modernity? I think I would get behind, and I think that would unite philosophy, it would unite various forms of scientific thinking and artistic processes. So, I mean, I'm not trying to go backwards and idealize some prior to modernity point in time, but to acknowledge that there's other ways of thinking about work, because science is a very particular kind of work, right?
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Like I could see, like I was imagining that someone could have this artistic, as you described, like this passion for some kind of research project, and they could be sublimated and be practicing science, like even in a laboratory sense. Yeah, it's really interesting. Um, yeah, I think. What do you think about this idea of critique? Like, I think like there's something very important about critique in science. Like, I think like just on a philosophical level, that's like really what it's all about. It's critical. It's supposed to be critical.
Yeah.
And then I don't know. I'm like struggling with this in my kind of practice about critique, and I kind of have a critical mind, but like also empathy is so important. And I kind of see like this tension between critique and empathy. Um, I don't know how does critique feature in your practice? It's kind of a big question.
I don't know. I mean, I was a critical theorist. That's my association, since the word's up front in
Mm-hmm.
title. I teach at the New School for Social Research, so there's a long history of
Right.
critical theory there. But I'm pretty exhausted of it. I mean, it's as we were talking about before, the arrogance of the critic. To be critical, how do you be critical? How does one critique without certain, like the certainty and the knowingness? And if that's the case, shouldn't you just go off on a path, rather than have a negative object? It would be like in psychoanalysis, the word like counter identification. You need the identification in order to counter it versus taking up a position
I know.
in your own right. Um,
I
so I
agree
think
with
something about that's very important to me.
Yeah. Yeah. Like there's this negativity.
Yeah.
Uh, and then there's something about the negativity that evokes the opposite, which could be problematic. Actually, Bruce Fink, I was just reading his book on Lacan, or maybe it was the Freud one, but he was saying that people are too focused like on transfer, like go to the unconscious, don't focus on the obstacle as much. And I was thinking about that in relationship to American politics. Basically, it's a whole big discussion, but there's a lot of fixation on the obstacles
Mm.
and the negativity, and obviously they can be big important obstacles, but if there's like no positive vision, like that's not going to be very exciting to people. Or even if it's like we'll get some better healthcare, like it doesn't have to be utopian, it's like we have a path to doing this thing and you can trust us.
Yeah, it's pretty dismal and pretty locked into a logic of identification, counter identification, and taking things from the other and twisting them your own way. I mean, it's just bad. I mean, there's an amazing moment, I forget where it is, but Lacan talks about a two-party system. He makes a joke and he says, like, the alter ego, the alter ego is like a two-party political system that's going to be like locked in an infinite battle. And I was like, oh, I'm
Good
like, but
call.
that's us, I mean, then I guess we set ourselves up because we're not parliamentary politics. And we have this stupid two-party system, and we set ourselves up for the absolute and complete weird breakdown that we're in the middle of. And that's terrifying thought. It's absolutely terrifying. And I just read Naomi Klein's book Doppelgangers, which is very funny because she's always confused with Naomi Wolf, and they're like completely politically opposite spectrum of thinking.
Mm.
But I mean, she asks a question why this weird problem that seems like a contingency in her life is reminiscent of the political problem, because Naomi Wolf also became like a crazy right-wing anti-vaxxer. And yet they have very similar politics around vacuums of power. So she wrote Shock Doctrine about how
Yeah.
capitalism. Right, and the anti-vaxxers kind of have a similar position. I mean, in their libertarianism, they're interested in a moment in which they want to push back against governmental power. So, she got very confused about herself. Like, am I this this very like, is she me? Like, like she couldn't
Wow.
separate herself from this. And that's why she wrote the book. And why is the world kind of like this? So it's a fun trip in a way. And she
So
comes at the very end to the idea that all of this makes it impossible to think, like actually really think about life, the world, what's possible. You're just trapped inside of this mirror. Yeah.
yeah, because of the fear or the risk of both personally, like to the ego, but also maybe socially of
Losing.
ide- yeah, losing and being identified or having to counter identify. It's like, yeah, it's interesting. I'll have to check that one out, doppelgangers. Jameson, you've been like very generous with your time. It's been fun for me. So thanks for participating. I just have one final question.
Sure.
How can we help you and your work? Like, what can we do to help you as an audience?
Oh my God. No one ever asked how I can be helped. I have no idea. I don't know how to ask for help. So I mean, actually, there's something comes to mind, which is people think that you hear or like, that I don't know, once you're a writer at a certain level, like what you're good at or something, or what's good about what you do because you get all of this reinforcement and invitations. But actually you have no idea. You have very little idea what anything that you do means to anybody, like how it's helping them, like, and every once in a while you hear from somebody and it's really nice actually to understand very specifically what they take away from your work. And it's always surprising, so I learn a lot about myself as a thinker because I don't know what I'm doing. So I would just say that that's very helpful when people actually tell you uh, what your work has meant to them. So
Friends. Okay, so we will go, and that gives me a great invitation because I read all of Disorganization and Sex and didn't ask one question or talk about it. So I'll just send you an email. But friends, go read that and tell Jameson what you think of it. Thoughtful review, and then your next book will be coming out after the election on breathing,
that's
and
right.
we'll look out for that and look to send you nice reviews.
Yeah, it was supposed to be out sooner, but they wanted to avoid the election and avoid Christmas, which I guess is smart, but it makes me have to sit on this book that's pretty much done for another 6 months, which is,
Yeah, you can't like get it out like you
oh,
want to.
I know, go away. And
Yeah,
then when it comes out, I have to go back to all of it. It's terrible.
yeah, and we need like a book on breath now more than ever, I feel.
Yeah, I
But
agree.
okay, thanks everyone for watching, and thank you, Jameson.
Thank
See you
you.
see you all
Thank
next
you
time.
so much.